Okay. Like, well, could I ask people maybe just to take a seat, and we'll commence the 11 o'clock session. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Very orderly this morning. Must be in good form after the cup of tea, so I came at the right time. So I'm Myra Murrell. I'm Chief Executive. So I'm delighted to be here today because as a summer school, it's a summer school that's, I suppose it's half Tuchton County, County it's Callul, and also it's Anna Samular Fad. So I'm really, really delighted. And I thank you so much for being here, and it's a very important calendar event here in the county. I've been asked to moderate this session, and it's the session that looks at the past in the present, 3 commemorations. And I think there are 3 very important commemorations that are grouped together here. The first looks at it's a century since women achieved the right to vote, and I think that's a very opportune time now to look back. And the second is 80 years since Bunreacht na hÉireann was the Constitution of Ireland was founded or put in place. And I think over the last number of years, and particularly possibly in the last decade, we've seen so many changes and shifts in social policy, and so many, I suppose, fundamental changes to the Constitution. I think it's a very good opportunity today to take a look at the Bunreacht na hÉireann, and also in the context of Article 41.2 and the discussions that are ongoing there around the place of women within the definition of the Bunreacht na hÉireann. The third centenary, it's the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and of course we'll all be aware it's really, really relevant today in the context of the Stormont administration and what's happening or not there. So my first speaker up here this morning is Professor Yvonne Galligan. Yvonne is a Professor of Political Science at Queen's University Belfast, and I think we're very, very fortunate here that year after year the organising committee managed to get such the calibre of speaker here in Cahersiveen. And Yvonne is a very influential woman, if I use that, in the whole area of women and looking at gender and democracy in the area of public and private policy. So I really look forward to the speech. Before I ask Yvonne to come up here, I do want to pay tribute because I think it's very important. Year after year, you know, we can all turn up and people like me can turn up and say, you know, isn't it great? But I know there's a lot of really hard work goes into this here by the organising committee. And I want to acknowledge the work of Marish Brick, Mary O'Connor and Junior Murphy and the other and many volunteers here in Cahersiveen. So just to want to acknowledge, say well done. So Yvonne, I'll pass over to you. So the presentations will be 20 minutes. We'll go through the 3 presentations and at the very end we'll take a questions and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moira, for that very warm and generous welcome. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Professor Maurice Brick and all the organising committee for the invitation that was extended to me to contribute to this illustrious summer school. So I'm going to look at the role of women in political life over the last 100 years in 20 minutes, but of course it could take 20 days and even longer. But let us begin with remembering what the vote has actually meant. So this year marks the centenary of women achieving the right to vote and stand in parliamentary elections in Britain and Ireland. So we have up here on the slide, on the left-hand side, the representation of the People Act, which became law on the 6th of February 1918. It introduced universal male suffrage over 21, and it enfranchised women over the age of 30, subject to a minimal property qualification. So it wasn't a free vote for women over 21, it was over 30. Then, subsequently, additional legislation on the 21st of November 1918 was enacted called the Parliament Qualification of Women Act. And it extended the right to stand for Parliament to women of 21 years of age. And that's the act on the right-hand side. And that's how long it was. It was just a few lines. This very short act had only one substantive provision, stating simply that women were not disqualified by sex or marriage from sitting or voting as members of the House of Commons. Now, as you can see immediately, this created an anomaly because a female candidate under the age of 30 couldn't cast a vote for herself. Later, the 1922 Free State Constitution in Articles 14 and 15 rectified that anomaly and set the voting age, as well as the age of candidacy, to 21 for women and men. But let's go back to 1918. In the subsequent December election, 17 women stood for election to the House of Commons, including 2 for Irish constituencies. Sinn Féin's Winifred Carney lost heavily in the solid working-class unionist constituency of Belfast, Victoria, which today is East Belfast and still remains very staunchly unionist. Constant Markovic's election for Dublin City St. Patrick's, with 66% of the vote, marked the first election of a woman to the British House of Commons. However, as a member of Sinn Féin, she did not take her seat in Westminster. Markovic's election and her subsequent appointment as Minister for Labour in the revolutionary First Dáil and the extension of universal suffrage in 1922 did not usher in a golden age for women in Irish parliamentary politics. In the 100 years since women won the vote, only 114 women in total have been returned to the Dáil by the voters, which is not much more than 1 woman for every year of the 100 years of suffrage. There was a 60-year gap before the Irish government had a second female minister after Markovic, when Charles Haughey appointed Moira Geoghegan Quinn as Minister for the Gaeltacht in 1979. Since then, indeed in total, only 19 women have held cabinet office. Various factors account for the scarcity of women in Irish parliamentary politics, especially in the early years after independence and partition. Many suffragists did not remain politically active, with prominent campaigners such as Hannah Sheehy Skeffington never becoming members of the Oireachtas. Women were more predominant in anti-treaty politics after Sinn Féin split and abstained from the Dáil following 1922. As a result, more women were elected in the 1920s than actually took their seats in the Dáil, including Kathleen Brugha, Kathleen Lynn, Mary McSweeney, Kathleen Clark, obviously Constance Markovic, and Kate O'Callaghan. At one stage, between 1927 and 1922, Margaret Collins O'Driscoll was the only female member of the Dáil. The women who were elected were often not staunch supporters of women's issues. The vote for the 1921 Censorship of Publications Bill, which, among other things, banned the publication, sale, and distribution of publications advocating birth control, gave Margaret Collins O'Driscoll, sister of Michael Collins, in her own words, more satisfaction than any other vote she cast in her 10 years in the Dáil. Some women became politicians by accident. Mary Reynolds won the seat for Fine Gael in a by-election in Sligo Leitrim in 1932, following the shooting dead of her husband, the sitting TD Patrick Reynolds, during the 1932 general election. But she did not speak in the Dáil until 1942. Similarly, Bridget Redmond succeeded her husband, Captain William Archer Redmond, John Redmond's son, as a Fine Gael TD for Waterford, following his sudden death in 1932. Obviously a bad year for male politicians in Ireland. Neither of these two women spoke out on the 1934 Conditions of Employment Bill, which introduced unequal wages for women into law. Mary Bridget Ryan, whom you see on the slide also, was a member of Cumann na mBan and a founder member of Fianna Fáil. She took over her husband's seat when he died in 1943 and held it until 1961. An opportunity to increase women's representation rose in 1936 when the Seanad in its 1922 form was abolished. The Joint Committee of Women's Societies and Social Workers seized the moment to advocate for equal representation. The Joint Committee proposed a requirement that there be at least one woman on the ballot in every electoral area, believing that women voters would do the rest, as they were so keen to increase women's presence in politics, was their belief. They also sought nominating committees for the Seanad to include issues of healthcare, social welfare, and primary education, arguing that the representation of these areas would give women's interests a voice in Parliament, if not actual representation. Their petition was received in a lukewarm manner by the Commission on the Second House of the Oireachtas, and the gender quota proposal, as they had suggested, was rejected. Although the 1922 Free State Constitution advanced women's equality with men, the document was silent on the Easter Rising Proclamation's promise of equal opportunities. As we know, policy and law in the 1920s and 30s eroded women's status as equal citizens, with women's jury service made discretionary, birth control outlawed, and women's employment opportunities restricted. The reinscription of a conservative gender order culminated in the majority public support for the 1937 Constitution, which banned divorce, confined women's citizenship to the home, constitutionally restricted women's employment opportunities, and enabled laws to take into account differences of capacity and social function. The only dent women's activism could make in this very restrictive gender regime was in securing recognition of women's rights to equal citizenship with men in Articles 9 and 16. However, indications of change emerged in 1977. In that election, 6 women were returned to Dáil Éireann, an outcome that had been last achieved in 1921. It reflected a modernising Irish society, a pattern of change which began in the 1960s as the economy transitioned from reliance on agriculture to service provision. Vatican II reformed Catholic teaching, the spread of television brought alternative views and experiences into households, and a new generation of young, educated women sought to shape a different lifestyle for themselves. Women began mobilising for change during the 1970s, and a plethora of new women's and feminist organisations emerged. Among them was the Women's Political Association, formed in 1971 to campaign for women's election to Parliament. Further attention to this issue came through the Commission on the Status of Women, whose report in 1973 highlighted the dearth of women in politics and public life, among other inequalities and discriminations. The proportion of women elected to Dáil Éireann gradually began to rise, increasing from 6 in 1977 to 14, or 8.4%, in 1987. In 1990, the election of feminist lawyer and Senator Mary Robinson as President of Ireland was a tangible indication that a modern, pluralist Ireland was coming of age. And here I have a photograph taken of an event on the 90th anniversary of the vote, where gathered together were all the living women members of the Oireachtas. So there was over 70 women in that photograph, ranging from TDs elected in 1954 right up to women TDs on that day. And the whole idea of that photograph was actually to give a visual representation of what it would look like to have a parliament that was equally composed of women as well as of men. And I think that photograph makes the point very, very clearly. The mobilisation of women in support of Mary Robinson's presidential campaign did not go unnoticed by political parties. Leveraging this women's vote and women voters, political parties, for the first time in their histories, took the issue of women's candidacy seriously. In the 1992 general election, there was an increase in the number of women candidates running, up from 52 in the previous election to 89 in 1992. With more women on the ballot paper, the number of women elected increased, indicating that both women and men as voters are actually very happy to see women on the ballot paper, and if they do get to see them, they actually do get to vote for them. So the women's representation went up from 13 women TDs to 20. It seemed that Mary Robinson's election was the much-needed catalyst for change in Irish political party candidate selection processes. However, this change proved short-lived. In the 5 general elections between 1992 and 2011, women's candidacy was, in some cases, subject to reversals, and the number of women elected increased only marginally from 20 to 25, which is 15% of a Dáil. At the time, underlying socio-economic patterns at the same time, during this period, pointed to a country experiencing major change. And in a way, it was the incongruence of the significant social and economic change in terms of women's situation that was taking place at the time, and the slowness of the party system to respond that created quite a tension. In 1971, before the lifting of the marriage bar on women's employment, the female employment rate was 27%. Of that 27%, and of those women, only 13.5% of them were married, indicating the effect of the marriage bar. In the years that followed, female employment rate increased steadily, and to rising to 61% in 2007, and by 2018, it had actually surpassed that, despite the economic recession in the meantime, and today it stands at 63%. So, where are we? Máire Geoghegan Quinn's ministerial appointment 4 decades ago ushered in an era of growth for women in politics in the Republic. There have been 2 female presidents since then, 6 female party leaders, 4 female Taoiseach. As you can see, 19 women holding the office of Cabinet Minister, full office of Cabinet. But as yet, no woman has held the offices of Taoiseach, Minister for Finance, or Minister for Foreign Affairs. To this day, progress in women's political representation is slow. Women today make up 35 or 22% of members of the Dáil Éireann, compared to the House of Commons, which is 1/3, the Welsh Assembly, which is 40% plus, the Scottish Parliament, which is over 1/3. So we're comparing ourselves. We are behind the curve in that regard. At local government level, a critical area for increasing women's political representation at national level. At local government level, this proportion falls to 25%. And I think there's a big job of work to be done in the upcoming local elections in that regard. Political parties long blamed the reluctance of women to come forward to stand for election as being the problem. In other words, that the issue rested with women. However, the reality was that parties were by and large an unwelcome place for women who had political ambitions. The new interest and openness towards women as potential candidates has been accelerated by the 2012 Electoral Amendment Political Funding Act, which requires parties to select at least 30% candidates of each sex or suffer financial penalties. Here, I would like to recognise the leadership shown by Micheál Martin in bringing Fianna Fáil around to implementing this quota legislation. That was no easy task, as it challenged the party culture in a very fundamental way. And I think it continues to be an issue that needs to be worked on very strongly. But the effect of this quota, which applied during the 2016 general election, led to a 90% increase in female candidacies, from 86 in 2011 to 163 in 2016, and a 40% increase in female members of Parliament, from 25 to 35. The public now expects to see male and female candidates on the ballot paper, and there was only one constituency, and I'm glad to say it was not Kerry, where there were no women at all on the ballot paper. In a recent speech to a similar gathering as this one, Culture Minister Josepha Madigan chafed at the underrepresentation of women in political life. Ms. Madigan said that the time frame to reach a gender candidate 40% threshold by 2023, which the Act says, should be speeded up. She said political parties should aim for a 50-50 split in terms of candidate selection naturally, but if that doesn't happen, serious consideration should be given to increasing the existing quota threshold from 30 to 50%. Her views echoed the demands of the Joint Committee on Women's Societies and Social Workers over 8 decades ago. As part of recognising our slim heritage on women's contribution to politics, and in the context of the centenary anniversary of women's suffrage, Countess Markievicz finally made it to the Palace of Westminster, when a copy of her portrait was presented last month by Ceann Comhairle Seán Fiúil, along with Senator Ivana Bacik and Catherine Martin TD, to the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow MP. The original, painted by Polish artist Bolesław Sanowski in 1901, hangs in the Hugh Lane Gallery. A century after suffrage, the goal of gender equality in representative politics on the island of Ireland has advanced, but has not been achieved. The 2016 elections point to a defining moment in our electoral history, but there is plenty of room for progress, and no doubt we can continue the discussion on progress after the next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you very much. We'll come back at the end, so you can jot down your questions or queries or observations. I think there's a lot of thought there, and very interesting to hear around the quota and your views around that as well. So our next speaker up is Professor John Coakley. John will speak on the Good Friday Agreement, context and aftermath. John is the Professor Emeritus of Politics
2011, of 589 days without a government, the guts of 2 years. The comparison is not quite accurate. So to start with, Belgium had not really been without a government even for a day, since its outgoing government had continued on in a caretaker capacity until a new coalition was negotiated. The same kind of constitutional practice as here in the Republic, where we're familiar with caretaker governments of this kind. On the other hand, Northern Ireland was not entirely without government. It had the safety net of rule from London, with the Northern Ireland Secretary, Karen Bradley, responsible for the overall government of the province. This episode, nevertheless, drew attention to the prolonged collapse of some of the central institutions established 20 years ago by the Good Friday Agreement. 2 decades after the optimism surrounding the conclusion of that agreement, it's worth revisiting the agreement itself and asking whether it continues to be fit for purpose. Does the agreement still offer the most appropriate blueprint for the government of Northern Ireland and for relationships with the Republic and with Great Britain, or is it time to amend or even replace that key document? So what I'm proposing to do in this presentation then is to make 5 interrelated, very general points. The first is essentially a description of the Good Friday Agreement, quite a challenge given the complexity of that document. Second, I'll make a prediction about certain of the political forces that underlie the agreement, in particular changing demographic pressures that have also altered the whole context of the agreement. Third, I'll make a qualification of this prediction, and the qualification has to do with the fact that demographic change will not itself necessarily lead to political change because of the complexities of public opinion. I'll issue a reminder about one important ingredient in the Good Friday Agreement, which is the extent to which it provides a path to Irish unity. And I'll conclude by essentially warning that the agreement needs careful navigation. We shouldn't dismiss it lightly, and we need to take its provisions very seriously. So first, what is the agreement? Well, a better person than me to say what the agreement is sitting in front of us, another panellist, Martin Manser, who his name was not up in headlights, but Martin played a key role in the negotiation of the agreement and also in the years that preceded this, in the very, very tough negotiations between Fianna Fáil, in or out of government, and other political forces. So the agreement itself is a very, very complex document. It's long, 12,000 words. It's very carefully drafted, but deliberately ambiguous in places, and perhaps mistakenly ambiguous or less deliberately ambiguous in other places. Very widely accepted, with the major force on the island of Ireland refusing to accept the agreement being Ian Paisley's Democratic Unionist Party at the time, even though by 2006 they had come around to acceptance of a version of this with minor modifications. So what is the agreement? Here's my 3-line summary. It's too complex to go into the detail of what the agreement is, but essentially provides a kind of a constitutional basis for the government of Northern Ireland by making provision for power sharing institutions, for north-south bodies of various kinds, and for certain east-west institutions. Importantly, and one of its selling points to Republicans was that it provides a pathway to Irish unity if in the future a majority of the people of Northern Ireland so wish. So let me begin with the prediction. Now, prediction is extraordinarily difficult these days because of all the uncertainties associated with Brexit. So we can't second guess. We don't know what form Brexit is going to take. So prediction needs to be, at the political and constitutional level, needs to be undertaken very, very carefully. However, it's easier to make predictions about certain underlying forces that have changed in the past 20 years. They've changed even more dramatically if the starting point is pushed back before 1998, if we go back to the late 1960s, early 1970s, when the Northern Ireland conflict began. These changes are interrelated. So I'm going to look at 3. So the first is a purely demographic one. The demographic relationship between the Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland. Second, the socioeconomic one, the emergence of equality rather than repair the existing pattern of long-standing inequality between these two communities, and then a quite dramatic shift in political balance within Northern Ireland, from dominance by one set of political forces to substantial parity between them. At the demographic level, here's a graph taken based on the 2011 census, the most recent census in Northern Ireland, that's very, very eloquent indeed, and has clear pointers for the future. So if you look at this graph, you'll notice that as the age cohort increases in Northern Ireland, the proportion of Protestants increases and the proportion of Catholics decreases. So it was already the case by 2021 that for those aged under 40, there was Catholics outnumbered Protestants. So to put this very vividly, I imagine myself walking through, for example, Botanic Gardens in Belfast. If you see somebody walking towards you and that is an elderly person, that person is likely to be Protestant. If it's a child or a teenager, that person is likely to be Catholic. A big shift has been taking place at that level. That shift inevitably transforms itself into what can be presented as two very different patterns of demographic evolution in recent years. So traditionally, in the middle of the 20th century, Protestants in Northern Ireland outnumbered Catholics by a ratio of about 2 to 1. By 2011, as you can see there, this gap had closed very substantially, and my calculation, based on the figure that I showed you a moment ago, based on age cohort analysis, my calculation would be that by 2021, Protestants will be about 46.2% of the population, Catholics 46.1%, and others 7.7%. Now, they're very careful predictions based on very, very conservative assumptions about the pattern of change. I suspect that, in fact, the proportion of Protestants will be lower, and the proportion of Catholics and others will be higher than the figures I've just mentioned. So that's the very, very dramatic set of demographic changes that have been taking place. In addition to this, big changes have been taking place at the socioeconomic level. It was traditionally the case, and had been the case since the 18th century, of course, throughout the island of Ireland, that Catholics were a marginalised population, not just politically, but also in the socioeconomic domain. In the early 1970s, for example, the Catholic male unemployment rate was about 25%, fluctuating around this level, about 25%. At the same time, the Protestant male unemployment rate was about 10%, a big, big difference between the two. This also fed over into the employed section of the population. Protestants were much more likely to be in positions of prominence in the more prestigious and better paid occupations. Now, if you look at this graph, taken from data going back to 1990, shortly before the Good Friday Agreement, what we'd see is a remarkable shift over time. If you look at that blue line, so the blue line represents the overall labour force. So we can use that as a kind of a standard. We expect employment levels within different sectors of the economy to be close to that line if we're in circumstances where there's substantial equality and fairness. We don't quite find that. So I've omitted from the graph the private sector employees, because in fact the line is identical to that blue line. I've omitted the civil service. The line is identical to that blue line too, even though we know that in the upper levels of the civil service there are still significant Catholic-Protestant differences. Employees in local government still disproportionately like to be Protestant, but not by a great amount. When we move to the policing, however, and the security sector, there are quite significant differences. So notwithstanding the Patton report adopted or following the Good Friday Agreement itself, notwithstanding that, and notwithstanding changed recruiting policies in the police service of Northern Ireland, it continues to be the case that the police service is disproportionately Protestant. About 70% of police officers and about 81% of civilian employees of the police service are Protestant. So still a problem there. If we look at the hugely important area of unemployment, however, the top yellow line indicates the breakdown of the labour force into Catholics and Protestants of the unemployed section of the labour force. And we would expect this line to be close to the blue line as well. It's not as well above this, suggesting that there are still significantly higher Catholic unemployment rates than Protestant ones. But the pattern is one of convergence. The difference between the two communities is diminishing. The third important change has to do with the position at political level. So I've reproduced in this graph the results of elections, the share of votes from 1965 to the most recent election in 2017. And what we'll see here again is a pattern of steady convergence until the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So the Good Friday Agreement is indicated by that light grey bar. Since then, a position of more or less of relatively little change between the two until the 2017 election, where opinion became highly polarised, and the combined Unionist vote and the combined Nationalist vote were almost identical. Now, so what I've painted there is a fairly stark picture of change at the demographic level and in terms of socioeconomic status between the two communities. We need to be very careful of reading too much into this in respect of its political significance. It is hugely politically significant, but perhaps not as politically significant as some people imagine. Because the emergence of demographic parity does not imply a tipping of public opinion towards Irish unity. And the reason for this has to do with the different patterns of attitude within the two communities. Protestants remain solid in support for the Union, but Catholics do not remain solid in support for Irish unity. Far from it. Catholics largely accept the constitutional status quo, implying the absence of support for Irish unity, and this suggests that the Union is secure for the foreseeable future if we were to rely on these figures. So just to be clear what I'm talking about, I'm suggesting here that a big chunk of Northern Ireland Catholic opinion, about half Catholic opinion, is happy with the Union. This includes a very large chunk of the SDLP electorate, but also includes a significant portion, about 25%, of the Sinn Féin electorate. You vote Sinn Féin, but you favour the Union. Now, another note of warning is important here, that Brexit may completely undermine this kind of relationship between public opinion and constitutional attitudes. There's a chance that soft supporters of the Union, in other words Catholics, who support the Union for instrumental reasons, or Protestants who may support it for more than instrumental reasons, that many of them, because they wish to remain in the EU, they may shift their opinion on the unity question. To illustrate this point, I've summarised here the result of a whole set of survey data going back to Richard Rose's survey in 1968. If we look at more recent years, the position on the Protestant side is quite straightforward. The great majority of Protestants, up to between 80 and 90% of Protestants, say that they want to retain the Union in one form or another, either under the principles of the Good Friday Agreement, with devolved government, or under direct rule. When we move to the Catholic side, the position is quite different. So the big green blocks on the Catholic side do not match the big red and orange blocks on the Protestant side. So consistently in surveys, this large portion of the of Catholic respondents indicate that they're happy with the Union, with between 40 and 50% supporting Irish unity, as you can see from this figure. Now, these bars are important because if you look at the last two of these, 2016 and 2017, both of these are based on fieldwork that took place in December of the relevant years after the Brexit vote, after the British Brexit vote of 2016. So it suggests, if we're to believe these figures, it suggests that Brexit has not so far had a big impact in dislodging support for the Union, not so far. Now, there are other survey data, not directly comparable with these, that tell a different story. They suggest that there has been a big change. So what I would suggest is this is the pattern that emerges if we look at the Northern Ireland Life and Times series, which is consistent over time. But there's another story as well. So we need to be careful in interpreting these. By way of an aside, it's worth noting that attitudes towards Brexit and towards the UK's departure from the EU vary very considerably between the Protestant and Catholic communities. Catholics tend to be overwhelmingly in support of remaining in the EU. Protestants much more divided. You see this, I've taken here the 5 largest parties in Northern Ireland and looked at survey data from 2 points in time, the middle of the year 2016 and the middle of the year 2017. These are different survey data from the ones I just illustrated. And what you can see from here is that on the nationalist side, there's been, if anything, a consolidation of support for remaining in the EU. There's been virtually no change, at least according to these data, on the Protestant side. So, to move on then to a reminder, the Good Friday Agreement sidelined certain fundamental principles of traditional Irish nationalism. And this is one of the most profound shifts that is recorded. Traditionally, Sinn Féin had argued that, and Republicans had argued, that the relevant decision-making unit for determining the future of all parts of this island was the population of the entire island. The Good Friday Agreement reflected a fundamental change in that position. The collective vote of the island of Ireland is no longer crucial. What is crucial is a separate vote within Northern Ireland and within the Republic. The constitutional future of Northern Ireland is to be determined by separate decisions in these 2 jurisdictions. But for Republican acceptance of this, there was a quid pro quo. And the quid pro quo was that if in the future a majority in each jurisdiction wanted Irish unity, then the British government, and of course the Irish government, but the British government in particular, would facilitate this. And again, I'm not going to dwell on this particular extract from the agreement itself, but remarkably enough, the agreement can also form a constitutional basis in the context of Irish unity. So this is spelt out in some detail in the agreement. In particular, I draw attention to one clause which says that whichever choice is freely exercised by a majority of the people of Northern Ireland, the power of the sovereign government jurisdiction there shall be exercised with rigorous impartiality. That implies the sovereign government in Northern Ireland could be either the British government or the Irish government. So, finally, a warning. So, 20 years on, the Good Friday Agreement is getting to look tattered. Certain components have never been implemented. The Bill of Rights, for example, that was promised at the time, the North-South Consultative Forum. Others have disappeared. The Civic Forum, a very useful body created under the terms of the agreement, has disappeared. And periodically, even the Assembly, the Executive, and the North-South Ministerial Council themselves are suspended, as is the case at the moment. If we actually try to measure it and look at the first 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement itself in April 1998, if we look at the period up to April 2018, then for only 61% of this period were the institutions up and running. In addition to this, more recently, there's been an apparent questioning of the consent principle. This is the principle to which Sinn Féin signed up and which was crucial in getting Republicans to support the agreement. So, for example, I find it really hard to interpret this particular commitment. The statement of Theresa May's is made, not just made repeatedly by her, but also by other leading British politicians. It says no UK Prime Minister could ever agree to a border through the Irish Sea. But the Good Friday Agreement says yes, they would be prepared to accept this in certain circumstances if majority in Northern Ireland so wished. We sometimes get similar views expressed in the South. The Taoiseach, for example, said some time ago, he questioned whether a 50% majority in Northern Ireland would be sufficient to trigger change in Northern Ireland's constitutional status. And one of the key negotiators of the agreement, Bertie Ahern, has said this on a couple of occasions himself too. Now, the thinking behind this, Bertie Ahern's thinking and Leo Varadkar's thinking behind this is quite subtle and complex, so I wouldn't like to dismiss it. But it seems to me to be fundamentally dangerous to question this norm of 50% as the key component in making a decision on the future status of Northern Ireland. So there's wide support for sticking with the current agreement, however dog-eared it is, until it's superseded by a similarly comprehensive, widely accepted and demonstrably better alternative. But negotiating such an alternative would be an enormous challenge, and I wonder whether it even succeed. Might we lose more than we gain in any attempt to renegotiate the agreement or leave significant portions of it aside? So Brexit seems to me to raise challenging questions to which the Good Friday Agreement may well provide at least partial answers. So I would ask whether this is a good time to tinker with it. The Good Friday Agreement has undoubtedly come under assault from domestic pressures within Northern Ireland. The Assembly and Executive have suffered long periods of suspension. The City of Quorum has disappeared, as I mentioned. The Bill of Rights has never been enacted. The North-South Consultative Forum has never come into existence. Even the North-South Parliamentary Tier came into existence only in 2012, and then in weakened form. The agreement is also likely to come under pressure from the Brexit process. Quite apart from the prospect of a restoration of a hard border, the agreement's innovative provisions for cross-border bodies, its liberal arrangements for citizenship rights in Northern Ireland, and the existing operation of the Common Travel Area are likely to come under threat at a level of intensity that will depend on the ultimate nature of the Brexit package. The Good Friday Agreement, however, also offers a potentially powerful line of defence against the more damaging aspects of Brexit, with their implications for the maintenance of peace that the agreement was so instrumental in consolidating. The fact that it's a UN-registered international treaty gives it a standing that has some symbolic value, but that will not protect it against political pressures. However, the prestige of the agreement as an iconic peace deal in late 20th century Europe may endow it with sufficient status not just to survive Brexit, but even to help shape the Brexit process itself, and to temper those of its provisions which are particularly menacing for the future peace and prosperity of the island of Ireland. Thank you.
I promised it would be thought-provoking, and it certainly delivered on that. Thank you, John. Our final speaker is Dr. Martin Manstra, who will speak on the topic of Bunreacht na hÉireann, context and development. And Martin Manstra needs absolutely no introduction at all to the audience. Martin is a former minister and TD and senator, and he has served as a special advisor to Trí Taoiseach before his election to the Oireachtas. John referred previously to Dr. Manstra's involvement in the negotiation of the Northern Ireland peace process. So thank you, Martin.
Public representatives, members of the clergy, fellow speakers, historians, chief executive, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour to speak in an event associated with Daniel O'Connell, and I'd like to thank Maurice, Mary and Julia for making the arrangements. I was delighted last month that the Cabinet decided to hold one of its occasional out-of-Dublin meetings at Derrynane House. Given that Daniel O'Connell was the principal progenitor of the constitutional tradition in Irish politics, and that his biggest lifetime achievement, Catholic emancipation, was one from which everything else has flowed. The main achievement of parliamentary constitutional politics from O'Connell to Redmond was to create a public familiarity and identification with it so that the adoption and adaptation of it in an Irish setting post-independence seemed natural and self-evident. Irish constitutionalism did face challenges from different directions over the decades, but all were successfully overcome. With much shallower constitutional roots, the near contemporaneous Soviet Revolution, when elections did not turn out satisfactorily, opted for dictatorship, and having cost millions of lives in the meantime, ultimately imploded and was not even officially commemorated in Russia last year. I was brought up in a historian's family, and I was made aware quite young in the mid-20th century that De Valera's Ireland had two grievances with O'Connell. The first was that he had been so emphatic about ruling out physical force, which it was considered had been vital in leading eventually to freedom in most of Ireland. The second was that though a fluent native Irish speaker, O'Connell was content to let the language wither when it was still widespread, and that he did not see Ireland's future as being a predominantly Irish-speaking country. With regard to the first complaint, all historical figures have to be seen in the context of the possibilities open to them in their time. As a young man, O'Connell had been witness both to the French Revolution and the 1798 rebellion, both of which resulted in bloodbaths. He was under no illusion that the British in the days of Peel and Wellington would employ whatever force was required to suppress rebellion, however high the casualties, to keep Ireland within the Union. Democracy or consent did not come into it. From their point of view, O'Connell was a skilled and dangerous agitator, operating like Parnell in the early Land League days and like the later Northern Ireland civil rights movement in the ambiguous space between constitutional politics and revolution. Wellington and Peel eventually gave way on emancipation to avoid the horrors of civil war, and also because opinion was divided. Many of the elite would have shared the position of Maria Edgeworth in being strongly pro-emancipation but anti-repeal. With regard to the Irish language, O'Connell adopted a utilitarian viewpoint. He was mindful of the scale of Irish emigration, even pre-famine, to Britain and its overseas colonies in the United States. On both issues, the admissibility of force in the language, Young Ireland and Thomas Davis took a sharply different position that was followed by the Irish Ireland movement and by Eamon de Valera. Revival and preservation of the language as championed by the Gaelic League from the 1890s won and retains public support to this day. But the same economic interests already evident in O'Connell's day also led to a lack of public support to go further, to try and make Irish the main spoken language in Ireland as, say, Hebrew became in Israel or Czech in the Czech Republic. The first point to be made about Bunreacht na hÉireann is that it was the Republican Constitution that had failed to materialise in 1922. The agreed draft that went across to London in May 1922 for approval was negotiated between the pro- and anti-treaty sides, put sovereignty, not Commonwealth membership, out front, and omitted the oath and other trappings of a Dominion status agreed in the treaty. It was the centrepiece of the Collins-De Valera Pact designed to avert the danger of civil war. The last thing the British wanted was reconciliation of the treaty split and the rehabilitation of De Valera. But apart from that politics, the whole definition of the British Commonwealth and the rights of dominions were in a state of flux. For the imperial ideologues on the British side, it was not just a question of not allowing the Irish Free State to take liberties, but also of not allowing them to set precedents. In the long run, of course, it was a losing battle, but that was in the years following the Irish Civil War. A second general point is that the 1937 Constitution was one of the major steps in dismantling the treaty and expanding the limited sovereignty that it initially offered. It not only helped fulfill the key part of a political programme, it also helped rally support from some of those who had had difficulty recognizing the legitimacy of the state. It became quite literally the foundation of what we today call constitutional republicanism. For much of the 20th century, the validity and even the existence of Irish nationality was contested by unionists, British and Irish, who did not want to accept that the Irish people had separate rights. There was either no Irish nation at all, or Pace W.F. Moneypenny, there were two Irish nations. In response, it was natural, therefore, that emphasis should be put on the two features that distinguished Ireland from Britain: the Irish language and associated cultural and sporting traditions, and secondly, Irish Catholicism, including the long struggles of the Irish Catholic people. This had a tendency to push into the background awareness of the diverse racial origins of the Irish people and even the positive contribution of people from other religious traditions. This is most obviously exemplified in the preamble to the Constitution, evoking the religious and political persecution of the past and the atmosphere of the penal laws, where we, the people of Eire, are humbly acknowledging all our obligations to our divine Lord Jesus Christ, who sustained our fathers through centuries of trial, gratefully remembering their heroic and unremitting struggle to regain the rightful independence of our nation. It is deeply ironic, but presumably not consciously intended, that the language of the preamble so closely echoes that of another foundation document, the Ulster Covenant of 1912. In the passage where we, the men of Ulster, loyal subjects of His gracious Majesty, are humbly relying on the God whom our fathers in days of stress and trial confidently trusted. I suppose part of the attraction of religion is the notion that the divinity is on our side and sanctifies our cause, whatever that happens to be, even while so much in demand from other and opposing causes. It should be noted that while there are articles in the Constitution relating to religion, the preamble gives them an explicitly, though not necessarily exclusively, Christian context. Another irony is that the article which was removed from the Constitution in 1972, I think, Article 44, is that was actually inspired by Republican France, viz. The Concordat of 1802, which spoke about Catholicism being the religion of the vast majority of the French people. Now, when I say Republican France, this was during the Consulate. Napoleon was to become an emperor 2 years later. In an interview with Joyce Kilmer of the New York Times magazine published on the 20th of August 1916, Moira Regan, a member of Cumann na mBan from Wexford who had been in the GPO during Easter week, summed up not only what the rising had been about, but also its sequel during the War of Independence, and I quote, "We have been living in a country that had no national life, and suddenly we were shown we had a national life. We were a province, and now we are a nation. We were British subjects, and now we are Irish." This spirit is reflected in Article 1 of Bannacht na hÉireann. The Irish nation hereby affirms its inalienable, indefeasible and sovereign right to choose its own form of government, to determine its relations with other nations, and to develop its life, political, economic and cultural, in accordance with its own genius and traditions. This is the greatest possible contrast to Article 1 of the Irish Free State Constitution, substituted by the British for a strong assertion of self-determination and sovereignty in the original draft, and instead dictating its place in the world as a co-equal member of the British Commonwealth of Nations. The Constitution contained no trace of the treaty or dominion status, but one allusion to external association. Buried in Article 29.4.2 is a provision permitting the state in its conduct of international relations to avail of any organ or instrument used by any group of nations with which the state is associated. And George VI continued to sign letters of credentials for Irish diplomats, though he humorously objected to being described as an organ. Amongst its other characteristics, the Constitution permitted Britain to continue to regard Ireland as a dominion, while Ireland did not so regard itself. Any such ambiguity came to an end when Ireland declared itself a republic and formally left the Commonwealth in 1949, leading to hasty reciprocal declarations that the UK and Ireland would not treat each other as foreign countries, and by extension each other's citizens as aliens, leading to the crystallization of the Common Travel Area in 1952, which survived later diminutions in the UK rights of Commonwealth citizens. In Articles 2 and 3, Bannacht na hÉireann asserted the political unity of Ireland in the sphere of right, but then proceeded to undo it in a constitutionally watertight way in the sphere of practical application. This also reflected De Valera's approach in 1921 when he told a private session of the Dáil, "We do not contemplate coercion." in his mind, a de facto statement, not a de jure one. Articles 2 and 3 govern domestic law, but had no standing in international law, which is why the British government were relaxed about them both at the time and for long afterwards. The boundary agreement of 1925 had copper-fastened the border. Articles 2 and 3 were more a statement about the legitimacy than the legality of partition, and they sufficed to keep most Irish Republicans in the state behind mainstream democratic politics. The 1949 Constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany was quite a close parallel, in that it asserted a unified Germany without attempting to exercise actual jurisdiction in the German Democratic Republic. From the late 1960s, there was the same debate about the need to recognize realities rather than perpetuate fictions. Both constitutions had a mechanism for incorporating missing territory, adhesion of the individual states of the GDR in the German Basic Law, and Article 15.2.2 in Bunreacht na hÉireann permitting recognition of subordinate legislatures, which corresponded to De Valera's proposal first made in 1921 and repeated in 1938 that the devolved Parliament of Northern Ireland should be transferred to the jurisdiction of the Irish state. It was intended to operate at arm's length, though in a less discriminatory way, so as to interfere as little as possible with the separate development of the rest of the country. It has often been described or misdescribed as a federal solution, eliding the difference between devolution and federalism, but presumably autonomy in an Irish framework would have had to be better constitutionally entrenched than it has been in a UK context. Both the non-recognition and the so-called constitutional claim were irritants to unionists in the context of any proposed North-South dialogue. Articles 2 and 3 were not unilaterally surrendered, as some here advocated, but rewritten in the context of a constitutional accommodation in 1998. If unionists had not been the demandeurs, then it is quite possible that the British government would, as they had done in the early 1980s, have attempted to exclude any constitutional dimension to the negotiations. And as John Coakley has emphasized, what the Good Friday Agreement did was to lay out a democratic and peaceful political path to Irish unity, consistent with the principles of consent and concurrent self-determination. And so far, despite instability in the political institution, the agreement has been an effective alternative to violence. And the former Taoiseach, Enda Kenny, did make an important point when he got to the agreement of EU partners, which kept open, if you like, the path to unity despite Brexit, that if the country became one again, then the whole territory, as in the case of United Germany, would be part of the EU. While Ireland is a nation state, the distinction between nation and state in the 1937 Constitution performed an important function in 1998 in that the right to Irish citizenship, along with the right to be Irish or British or both for those born in Northern Ireland, was underpinned constitutionally and by international agreement. The office of President gave rise to a lot of debate, owing to the suspicion by the opposition at the time that De Valera intended to turn himself into a presidential dictator on continental lines, something of which we have examples to this day. The outcome has been quite different, and the office of President has become that of a unifying figure with an ability to inspire while acting as a guarantor of the constitutional order. The function in other countries is mainly filled by persons who have given distinguished public service, and so far that has been the pattern here as well, with high standards consistently upheld. It is clear from the diverse number of candidates seeking a nomination at the moment that the criteria are neither too liberal nor too restrictive. After some hesitation, De Valera reinstated the Seanad after it had been abolished. A vote was held in recent years on its continued existence, and to some surprise, the people voted narrowly to retain it. The main justification for its existence is that it provides a second opinion on legislation, which has often been appreciated by ministers, and it also allows a more diverse range of people to contribute to public life. That it is both a training ground for young politicians and a place where voices of experience can be heard is not necessarily a defect. A second chamber should not be an obstruction, but a safeguard. And the French Senate is formed upon similar principles, being elected indirectly by those whom the people elect. The Irish parliamentary system, like the administrative one, is broadly modelled on Westminster, even though the Dáil is described in one place as the House of Representatives. For a long period, despite expectations to the contrary, the proportional representation system delivered stable single-party or coalition government. In more recent times, government formation involving a diversity of groups has become more complicated, as is often the norm on the continent. The prospect of substantial electoral reform appears remote, as the present system is fair and offers the voter genuine choice. Clientelism, as it is called, is wrongly attributed to PR as it existed in the later days of the Irish Parliamentary Party at Westminster. The criticism in many countries where populism has taken hold that parliamentary representatives are too remote is not one often made here. Representative democracy here is enhanced by two features: regular recourse to referendum to change the constitution, which is of course direct democracy underpinning the sovereignty of the people, and judicial overview of the constitutionality of legislation passed by the Oireachtas. There are all sorts of historical and cultural reasons why referendums are rare or eschewed altogether in some countries. Here, referendums occur in the main as a means of ratifying important foreign policy agreements, whether relating to the EU or a British-Irish agreement in 1998 of equivalent importance to the 1921 treaty, and as a means of agreeing divisive socio-moral change where a decision of the Oireachtas alone might not be as easily accepted. While the argument is often made that issues are far too complex to be satisfactorily encapsulated in a simple clause for referendum question, decisions made by referendum have a unique democratic legitimacy, though there is nothing to prevent a decision on any matter being revisited if necessary. The resort to referendum dates back to the experience of civil war, where there was no means beyond a simple parliamentary majority of ascertaining the people's will. Could be argued in an EU context that the requirement to hold a referendum in Ireland acts as a deterrent to treaty revisions that are not absolutely essential. The Supreme Court has a final say in the constitutionality of law. That system has functioned well, despite some ongoing controversy over the exact method of judicial appointments. The judiciary is independent and cannot be regarded as having been heavily politicised. President Woodrow Wilson is not a popular figure in Ireland for the way he was dismissive of Irish claims to be heard at the peace conference. This is sometimes attributed to his Ulster Presbyterian roots, though he once told Lloyd George that Carson should have been hanged. Notwithstanding Wilson's negative attitude to Ireland, his principles enunciated through 1917 and his 14-point plan in January 1918 had a huge impact in boosting the Irish demand for freedom and self-determination. Statements of Wilson's like, "We are fighting for the liberty, self-determination of all peoples. No people must be forced under a sovereignty under which it does not wish to live," were music to Irish ears and were picked up by leading Republican figures released in June 1917, such as Eamon de Valera and Thomas Ashe, who with others appealed to the US President and Congress. Throughout his life, de Valera acknowledged the debt to idealistic Wilsonian principles, and to a certain extent it could be said that the Irish approach to foreign policy is based on them. The Article 29 commitment to the peaceful settlement of international disputes has been augmented by a commitment to stay out of a common European defence if established, by implication unless changed by referendum. The advantages of geography, which have minimised defence needs, are balanced by recognition of a need to contribute to international peacekeeping. The new states created in the wake of the First World War were isolated and vulnerable. A remarkable Polish exhibition on the story of Consul Dobrzynski was shown recently in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. He represented in Dublin a government that fell victim to Nazi and then Soviet occupation. He saw the necessity for the fragmented states created post-1918 to come together for their survival. And despite neutrality, de Valera deeply sympathised with countries being crushed by larger neighbours, which is why the international rule of law was so important for smaller countries. Interestingly, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, in her lectures in America in 1917-18, following the murder of her pacifist husband in 1916 in Portobello Barracks, expressed the hope that at the end of the war there would be a united Europe on the model of the United States, where each state is free and independent, yet all a part of a great federation. She went on, "We want Ireland to belong to this united Europe and not be a vassal of Great Britain, a province of the British Empire governed without consent. The EU is a nuanced version of this." Whilst recognising private property rights, they were balanced by the exigencies of the common good. One could argue that in recent decades the balance has shifted too much in the direction of private property, with not enough robust emphasis on the common good that, for example, informed the work of the Land Commission. The possessing classes in the 19th century feared democratic dispossession and despoiling. They need not have worried. The really wealthy have developed their influence over the political system to a fine art. With the exception of the right to primary education, the directive principles of social policy are not justiciable. While many groups argue for the constitutional entrenchment of economic and social rights, the distribution of scarce resources is the primary function of the political system, not the courts, and absolute rights cannot override budgetary control. No doubt this is the reason why the government wishes simply to abolish the women in the home clause rather than replace it by a gender-neutral alternative. The biggest weakness of the Constitution was the way this seemingly innocuous clause underpinned with full clerical support the dilution and restriction of women's rights and role both before and after, such as removal from jury service, the marriage bar, and many other employment restrictions. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington claimed on several occasions that Lemass, and we're talking about the Lemass of the 1930s, even wanted to repeal women's suffrage, the one major achievement for women's rights. Like many other women, including Kathleen Clark and Dorothy McArdle, she was indignant with De Valera. The women in the home clause has long been an anachronism and should have been changed far earlier. A recent exhibition in the UCD archives contains some correspondence about this, with an emphasis on its conformity with papal encyclicals, which in many respects, but not this one, were generally progressive. It is difficult to escape the charge that the spiritual empire of which De Valera sometimes liked to boast was in part built on a church and state-backed misogyny, from which none of the Free State parties nor the Irish Parliamentary Party before it were free, though it is now well on its way to being expunged. And of course, whether empires, even spiritual ones, are a good thing is also perhaps a matter for questioning. To conclude, the Constitution is both renewable and reformable. A new Constitution, certainly this side of a united Ireland, is neither practical nor desirable, as so much case law has built up. Apart from certain shortcomings, it has provided or contributed to the progress, stability, and security of this state, giving us a national life of our own, as well as a place amongst the nations. Thank you.
Okay, I think that has been a wonderful insight and a very deep insight into Bunreacht na hÉireann, and has certainly put it in a very, very wide-ranging and context of its time and how it evolved. So thank you very, very much for that, Martin. I now want to open. We have a bit of time here. I think I'd like to just open it up. We've had Yvonne's talk, we've had John, and we've had Martin. So I think there's plenty of discussion points here. So would anybody like to start the discussion? Would you just like to put your hand up? We'll get a microphone to you. Okay, do we have anyone just to start? Or sure, if we get someone to start, we'll, this is like an auction, I think 'twill roll on. Okay, we have a lady at the very end there.
I would like to address the question to Yvonne and ask her if she has any, recommendations for how we can improve women's participation at government level. If that's a very general question, I know, but we have to start somewhere.
Thank you very much. Yvonne, would you like to address the? If I can get this to, maybe if I just.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you very much for that question. And I think it's a very interesting one, a very important one at this point in time. When in 2015, when the new Prime Minister for Canada, Justin Trudeau, came to form his government, he formed his government and presented it to the public. And the public in Canada saw that it was composed of equal numbers of women and men. And he was asked, why did you do this? Because this was quite a novelty. Why did you do this? And he just turned around and he said, because it's 2015. And so my recommendation to all people in politics here, including people who may be Taoiseach, is to say, well, it's 2018, it's 2019. We just have to have a representative democracy that is truly representative. And I think that's what has to be done. And since then, governments in France, in Spain, and in other parts of the world have followed that particular path. So not to do it would in fact be harking back in time rather than being in the present and looking forward.
Thank you for that. Is there any contrary view to that from the floor? Would anyone have a contrary view or a position on it? Yeah, gentleman over here.
Thank you. I don't really have a contrary view, but I think that it's wonderful to see men and women working together and how that complements us as people and society in general. What I do find disappointing is in Anglo-Irish relations that probably the most intransigent recent British Taoiseach was Margaret Thatcher, who I think impeded the progress of relationships in Ireland and indeed in other countries such as Argentina. And we now have a situation in our own country where we have women leaders of the main parties in Northern Ireland who don't seem to be able to sit down and work out a solution. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily gender bias, but I don't think we should be carried away. I think women bring so much more to all walks of life in terms of things that men are deficient in, such as networking, emotional intelligence, sensitivity. But it doesn't work across the board, and I'd be interested maybe in the panel's views on that observation. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin would like to come in at this point.
Yeah, I think on the other hand, probably while people have different views on her, I mean, the most capable leader in the Western world at the moment is Chancellor Angela Merkel. So, the answer is you can have, obviously, good, bad, and indifferent leaders, whether male and female. When this was first being discussed, which happened in the French Revolution, people brought out examples. Well, didn't we have, again, one might have different views on this, Queen Elizabeth I of England, and in the 18th century, the Empress Catherine, the Empress Maria Theresa? The answer were that the women rulers were just as capable as the men. And so I think that would be the general answer, and sometimes just as incapable.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think that certainly has summated that part of it. We have another. Can we move to perhaps another element of the discussion? Yes.
I personally don't think there'll be any difference whether you have men or women there. I think, if I could just, I suppose, one little thing. When I was growing up, young teenagers and boys in particular were seen on the roads of Ireland as driving very fast. Invariably, I find myself, when a speeding car is passing me now, it's not always a woman, but a lot of the time. So I don't think there'll be any difference myself, whether it's networking or otherwise.
Okay, thank you very much. So we actually, there's a gentleman at the end, and I saw him first, and I'll come over to Kathleen then, and I'll move to the lady behind Kathleen then at that stage. There's a gentleman here just at the very end here by the wall. Yes, gentleman here.
To John, I'd just like to ask a question. Given that the appetite for unity among Catholics in the North, surprisingly to my mind anyway, is not totally in favour of unity, I'm wondering, is there anything to suggest what the appetite for unity might be in the Republic at this stage?
Question.
There is, but unlike Northern Ireland, where there's a standard question. So the one that I showed, where I showed all those bars, there was a response to a standard question where people are given 3 options for the future of Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, in the Republic, there's no standard question. So lots of different questions have been asked over the years since 1968. It's very hard to form a conclusive opinion on what people in the South, how do people in the South react towards Irish unity. If you ask a soft question, so would you be in favour of Irish unity sometime during your lifetime? There will be a big pro-unity majority. But do you favour Irish unity as an immediate solution or within the next few years as a solution in Northern Ireland? That percentage will drop. Would you be prepared to pay extra taxation in the event of Irish unity? This will diminish so this question has been asked several times. There are fairly small minorities in favour of unity in those circumstances. But I do think that the position in both jurisdictions is very, very fluid. We shouldn't rely too much on opinion poll data, even though I use them a lot. So a lot depends on what lies behind these kind of answers that people will likely give, or they'll give to an interviewer to get rid of the interviewer. They need to be interpreted very, very carefully. And they're probably, in the case of Catholic supporters of the Union in Northern Ireland and Southern indifference to unity, these are not deeply held attitudes. So these may be relatively superficial attitudes that are easily dislodged by particular political events, such as the effects of Brexit.
Okay, thank you, John. I think Martin would like to comment.
I think the view of Northern nationalists is a little bit like St. Augustine. Yes, they want unity, but not just yet. And that, of course, was particularly so during the economic crisis. I think, as the example of Cyprus in 2004 shows, it's a question of terms and conditions. And I think Peter Robinson, leader of the DUP, he was being much more subtle than most commentators gave him credit for. I think he wanted to shift the discussion a bit to terms and conditions, knowing that that would throw out all sorts of problems and differences. It's one thing to talk about something in abstract, but it's another matter to talk about what it would actually mean and what sort of changes would mean. I sort of subscribe to the view now. It is the case, of course, that the two main nationalist parties are both in principle in favour of Irish unity, but I don't think that the conditions are there. Right, I'm not in favour of having a border poll unless it is meant to be really serious, instead of just a propaganda exercise that helps build support for this or that party.
Thank you, Martin. There was Kathleen here. I'll leave Kathleen in here, yeah.
If the Sinn Féin MPs took their seats in Westminster, what effects would it have, like with the Assembly in the North, with Brexit and a whole lot of things? Maybe Martin or John might answer that.
I think
please.
Martin will take that, Kathleen.
Just briefly. I don't hold the view that Sinn Féin taking their seats at Westminster would make any difference to the Brexit debate, because the system would close up. I mean, the British system is not going to allow British Tory MPs are not going to rebel against their own government if it's going to allow a perception that Sinn Féin brings down a British government. I think it's a mirage to think that No, I do actually think that Northern nationalists should be represented at Westminster, and the SDLP did that for a long number of years, but the Northern electorate, in its wisdom, decided that they didn't need that any longer. But as I say, I don't think Sinn Féin taking their seats, which would mean breaking a pledge, I have some sympathy with them on that. I don't think it would actually make any difference whatsoever.
John, would you like to comment on that point?
Yeah, I think at a superficial level, having the 10 DUP MPs in Westminster would actually, in theory, have made a difference to certain votes on Brexit in the House of Commons that are very, very narrowly carried. But Martin is right that British parliamentarians would react accordingly to this. So I don't think that it would make a huge difference. It might be worth noting a significant difference between the DUP's Westminster MLAs, who are very hardline on Brexit, and the rest of the party, which is moderate, rather more moderate, It's committed to Brexit, but not the same kind of intensity as the Westminster contingent.
Okay. Okay. There is a lady over there, and I'll try and take a number. Look, we do have a little bit of time, so yeah, there's a lady here, and I'll move over here then. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much to all the contributors. I really enjoyed it and found it stimulating. I'm back to the women, because I started my working life in unequal pay. And this may not be very popular to say this, but I gave up working because I wanted to mind my children. And I think that's the same problem. I can't see how you could be a politician and have a family and leave them, for all those hours. I think that's a major problem. And I wonder what your comments on that are. Thank you.
Vaughan, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment. I think that's a very important point that you make. I think that that the reform of this kind of legislation, what it actually does is it provides women with choices to make, so that they can actually make the choices that they want to make, rather than forcing them into a role that they necessarily don't want to have. And I think that's the core and the essence of it all. For example, the marriage bar forced women out of the workplace, and that was the whole intention of it. And there were very, very, very many women who either didn't want to or actually couldn't afford to be forced out of the workplace. So I think the removal of those kinds of restrictive forms of legislation, the removal of the enforcement element of it, which is symbolised in Article 42 in the Constitution, actually frees up. Doesn't mean that all women have to work. It just means number one, that people have choices to make the best informed decisions that they want to make that is in the best interest of them and their families and their wider communities. And it also recognises that women and men have equal scope to be citizens in whatever shape or form they want that citizenship to take, be it as a volunteer in a community that is the glue that keeps that community together, or whether it is as an elected representative. So I think that this is what it's all about, is choice and respecting the choice that people make for their lives.
Thank you, Yvonne. I think, Martin, you actually did make reference to it in your presentation as well, and you made quite an important point in relation to, rather than amendment to the referendum, if you look outside the budgetary. Would you like to just maybe expand a little bit, because it did strike me during your talk?
Yeah, well, I think it's clear if you read the history carefully that the article in the 1938 Constitution was used to underpin legislative disbarments of women from various roles. Now, I think all of us of a certain generation, most of us anyway, appreciate the way we were brought up, but society changes. And nowadays, and this, I have 4 daughters, so I would 3 of them have children. Nowadays, there's a childcare system in place. The modern economy, for better or for worse, it needs the participation of women, including married women with children. And it's when you've got politics thinking, now I hope I've got the country right, but I think the New Zealand Prime Minister recently had a baby and was having to feed it, breastfeed it not too far away from the chamber. You know, society changes, develop. I do agree with the point about choice. I mean, nobody is. Well, saying nobody is an exaggeration, but I mean, many people, they wouldn't necessarily be forced into the workplace, and of course there is parental leave, and people take time out. But I'm not sure there's much point in sort of regretting the way society has changed. I think we have to live it as best we can, and I think there's no great evidence that children brought up in the last, say, 10-15 years are suffering greatly, if at all, vis-a-vis their predecessors.
Okay, I'm going to go to the lady here now. I do apologise, I'm terribly right-handed, so I probably have not looked to this side, so I will move over afterwards.
Hello. Could I ask Dr. Martin Manser about the Good Friday Agreement and the setting up of the Assembly? And I'm wondering, was there any discussion about setting up a sort of an opposition assembly or a counter-assembly, so to speak, to solve the situation or situations that would arise? Because as I see it now, in my humility, it goes, if there's a problem, everything gets polarized, and then we have a stalemate. So I'm just wondering.
Well, obviously you're starting from the position that you have a divided community. That isn't an ideal situation. Now, the previous solution to that was majority rule or direct rule and so on. And people were perfectly clear is that either the two communities, through their political representatives, that is, had to work together, or things would be stuck. And that's unfortunately the situation. I mean, both sides have a veto. Now, I do think it's a regrettable situation. I have a lot of sympathy with the demonstrators a few days ago outside Stormont and elsewhere in Northern Ireland, who want the executive back, both for a whole range of practical matters that haven't yet been sorted, but also is the most vital negotiation is taking place affecting the people of Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland, collectively speaking, doesn't have a voice. Now, in the first few months after the Brexit vote, the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, Arlene Foster and Martin McGuinness, they did issue a joint statement finding some common ground between their two sides on priorities for Brexit. But unfortunately, that isn't possible now. But I don't think you can really attribute to defects in the agreement. I mean, there isn't, with such an evenly divided community, as John has demonstrated, there isn't a way, there isn't a deus ex machina that can come and solve or impose solutions. Mind you, I do think it would only take a little bit of political courage to cease or at any rate greatly reduce paying representatives who haven't been doing their parliamentary job anyway for the past 18 months. And it seems to me that that is very clearly attributable to the parliamentary situation at Westminster. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the merits of the case, and maybe if they weren't so bound hand and foot, the British government would do something about that. And in any case, the reality is they're not going to lose DUP support, because where has the DUP, where else has it to go?
John.
Just by way of adding to that, there are two other institutions that it's worth mentioning. So the first is one I refer to as one of those which has disappeared, the Northern Ireland Civic Forum. So this brought together representatives of civil society. It was created largely by pressure from the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition during the negotiations of the Good Friday Agreement. It was a potentially significant alternative talking shop, but it wasn't much more than a talking shop. But talking shops can perform a very useful function. Unfortunately, politicians in the Assembly had the same attitude towards this as politicians at Dáil often have, and in other parliaments often have, to the second chamber. They are the representative chamber. They, in some respects, resent the existence of any chamber that might present itself as an alternative. So that's one body. The second, which has also disappeared, is the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference. This was a potentially extremely powerful body created by the agreement. It met in the early stages of the first few years after 1998, but it has last met in 2007. Yes, it last met in 2007, but strenuous efforts were made by the Irish government to resurrect this body because it's also potentially useful in dealing with the Brexit question. And finally, the British did agree to a meeting, but the agenda, as far as we know, or the agenda as publicised, was minimalist. So there are such bodies. The agreement is very far-reaching in that respect, but unfortunately, one of these has disappeared. The other was allowed to lapse and was brought back in rather watered-down form.
Okay, good. As promised, I'm coming to this side. Right, we'll bring a microphone. Thank you. Just at the front row. Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, my question is primarily for Dr. Manser. And it is in relation to, I suppose, that seminal principle of the separation of powers. And my question is, do you believe that principle has been well served by our Constitution? And is that principle at risk of being eroded into the future? Now, I ask that question in a number of contexts. Dr. Manser referred to the non-justiciability of certain social and economic rights and obligations, but we've had judicial decisions in the past that have maybe entered into those rights. And I'm thinking particularly of some important decisions of the present President of the High Court, Mr. Justice Peter Kelly, in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And I'm also asking the question, I suppose, in the context of Dr. Manser's reference to property rights, that private property is protected under the Constitution, and to what degree the common good principle, which is very much, again, an important principle in the Constitution, has to be balanced against those property rights. And my final context is in terms of the present political controversy which is surrounding judicial appointments. So it's in all those contexts that I posed the question to Dr. Manser.
Well, I think with the last question, I really answered that when I said that I didn't think the judicial independence, which is a problem in even certain partner EU countries, I don't think that is a problem here. When you're talking about, effects of judicial decisions, I remember one of the first tasks I was given by Charles Haughey when he came back into office in 1987 was to tot up the cost of recent Supreme Court decisions. Anyway, I'm not sure any practical consequences arose from that. With regard to property rights, now this happened subsequent to a subsequent Minister for Justice than the one sitting in the audience. But land was bought in North Dublin for some 30 million pounds, euro, and it was just agricultural land, maybe a couple of hundred acres. And the then minister said to me privately, but you couldn't interfere with the property rights under the Constitution. Well, I am afraid I think that, and of course nothing has ever been built there, I think that is a daft extension of property rights. I greatly admire the University of Limerick that quietly bought up agricultural land across the Shannon to make themselves the best or most extensive campus in the state, and those lands were bought up at agricultural prices. And back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, we sometimes had a much more robust attitude to those things. I mean, say I've, with my brother, a farm in Tipperary, and in the 1950s, 3 acres were taken off it by the county council to build agricultural labourers' cottages. And the compensation was absolutely minimal. Whereas nowadays, say you want to build a Lewis line somewhere, and say from one end of this building to the other, you get compensation for 3 million, some private owner or institution. I just think that the balance has gone far too much in the direction of private property, and in a way that was not intended by the framers of the Constitution.
Okay. Certainly a very pertinent discussion in this part of South Kerry at the moment, for which I'll say no more. Ruth, Dr. Ruth, would you like to come in there?
Yes, not on that topic though. If I may just raise a different issue, and again a question to Martin, if you wouldn't mind addressing it. The Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, in the presence of the Pope last weekend, announced that he hoped to achieve a different church-state relationship in this jurisdiction. And I'm wondering if Martin could enlighten us as to what implications, if any, this has for any constitutional change, or is the Constitution robust enough to cover different models of church-state relationship?
Well, needless to say, given my political background, I'm not a spokesperson for the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, and what precisely in detail he and his advisors had in mind, I couldn't tell you. But I think you are talking about an evolving situation, which very often will involve negotiations with stakeholders. I mean, the whole question of, say, clerical control of schools. Now, in my experience, and maybe my experience is a little bit out of date, it's 7 years since I was in the Oireachtas, this exercises people in the Greater Dublin area a great deal more than it exercises people elsewhere, and maybe that's because that's where a lot of the population growth and demand is. I never had anybody come into my constituency clinic to discuss the matter of the control of schools with me. I had my cousin's children. She had 3 daughters, all educated in the local convent. Wasn't any problem. Her son went to Glenstall Abbey, and whether I should say this or not, he was assisted in his Anglican confirmation preparation by one of the brothers in Glenstall Abbey. I mean, there's a sort of fluidity and flexibility there about it that isn't a huge, but I mean, there is an ideological problem in many people's minds, which I'm sure will lead to some change. And I do think that the recent referendum result does raise issues which I haven't seen much discussed, but which will obviously have to be resolved, about ethos in certain voluntary schools, and whether the plans for the National Maternity Hospital will go full steam ahead without those being resolved. I have my doubts.
Okay, Martin. Would John? Okay, we'll move on. So we have about 5 minutes remaining. Is there anybody over on, sorry to discriminate, but is there anyone over on this side of the room who, there's a lady down here towards the end? And I'll come then to this side. We'll take 1 or 2 more.
It's back to the women, I'm afraid.
Okay, Yvonne. It's back to the women.
Yeah. While naturally I approve of equality to women in all spheres, education, labour and all the rest of it, I think this idea of a gender balance for political office is total rubbish. Now I would love to be a TD, but not to be elected because somebody said, well, we have to make up the numbers. How far would you go then? You could say, well, only people with brown eyes, or people with blue eyes, or people over 50 or under 50, or how far could you go with that sort of thing? I think Mrs. Merkel, of course, I'm a terrific admirer of her, and I don't think she was involved in any gender balance. It's just because she's damn good at her job.
Okay. Yvonne, do you wish to comment on that or that point? Or?
Yeah, thank you very much for that comment and that perspective. I mean, I think that your perspective is certainly one that we must debate and we must discuss. When you think of what we want our democracy to be, one of the things that the fundamental thing about democracy is that it is based on representation. And so the community of voters basically consist of male and female voters in all their different identities. So we have all kinds of people with the right to vote. And I think that was what it really was what made the suffrage campaign so strong at its time, when many other campaigns may have failed or weren't as successful. The right to vote was a fundamental right that was seen as being the basis of representative democracy. And so that means that women and men equally can go to vote. And so you would never say today that, well, only some women can vote, but all men can. And so I think that our suffrage sisters, if they were here today, would be saying, in fact, what we have to do is create the conditions and the opportunities for all women to feel that they can be fully part of the political system, including as representatives. And I don't think any of us here would disagree with that. The problem is, how do we make it happen? And I think that's where the debate comes about. Exactly how do we make it happen? And in over half the countries in the world, they have made it happen or tried to make it happen through adopting some form of mechanism that enables women to break through the cultures of political parties and the cultures of political systems that have prevented them from being there for decades and decades and decades. And so I think that's where we have to begin to think about these things and talk about them in this way. And of course, as individual women don't want to feel that they are the quota woman, but there is a much bigger picture here. And the bigger picture is, what do we value about our representative democracy? And do we want it to be truly representative? And then we work to find out how best to do that. And it's not unusual in other circumstances as well to find ways of representing the underrepresented. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, John showed us a picture of how Catholics are underrepresented in the security forces. Well, the reason for the increase towards the end was because the PSNI instituted quotas for Catholics in the PSNI service. And that's the reason for the increase. Now, since then, they've done away with them, and what's happened? The proportion of Catholics in the PSNI has begun to drop away. So this is a solution that is offered in many places, in many different circumstances, and the idea is to introduce fairness into the system again, where fairness had been pushed out of a particular process.
I would just say one of the very interesting facts that came from me was the fact that women, it's actually entry into the political party system. There may not be just a culture or something that would not be comfortable for the female, the woman to go and join the party because of a culture, or perceived culture. So I think that came across quite strongly. I'm taking one more. There's a gentleman here who you've had your hand up for quite a while here. Yes, and we'll come to you. And I think we'll wrap up at that stage.
I take Martin's point entirely that those of other than the Catholic persuasion who are Christian would feel very comfortable in a Catholic school, right, where there's a Catholic ethos and so on, and that their belief system would be supported and encouraged and all the rest. However, I think the reality is that we now live in a society that is far more secular and far more diverse. And we have got many more belief systems other than the Christian belief system in our system. We've also got many who would not see themselves as believers in any religion or wishing in any way to participate. That said, I suppose if I had young children today, I would want them to be given religious instruction or education in school because of my own inadequacy in doing it. But I think that we really have to face the reality that our schools are controlled so much by the churches, and where they are not, with Educate Together, it's a private body that controls them. And at the same time, we also have this whole idea of compulsory religion class for every student attending many of our schools, even though there's a new circle around that in the ETB and community schools. I wonder if Martin or others could comment on how we might go about addressing this challenge in a non-confrontational, I suppose, and effective manner, because I think it is a huge challenge, and I think it is alienating a lot of people in Irish society.
Okay, Martin, would you wish to take that?
Well, I think an evolutionary approach has to be adopted. You see, I do agree that there are a lot of people who feel very strongly about it, but they are a minority, and are we saying that because a minority feels very strongly about it, then the entire system has to be secularized? Now, I happen to come from a minority faith, and I know that the Church of Ireland, which is the particular faith, attaches a lot of importance to having schools. Now, I mean, religion is worn fairly lightly as far as I can judge, certainly these days in the schools, and I was on the board of a school chaired by the C of I Archbishop of Dublin, whoever that happened to be at the particular time, but where actually the intake was probably 70-75%, the secondary school, 70-75% Catholic. And again, you know, the idea that a sort of religion is heavily force-fed. I've 10 grandchildren, of whom about 6 are school-going. You know, I haven't heard complaints from them. I think it is a difficult issue. People feel strongly about it, and I think the solutions, have to be diverse and pluralistic. I don't think I wouldn't be in favour myself of, if you like, and I'm exaggerating, substituting for a monolithic church control, a monolithic secular control. And there are, like the speaker, there are a lot of parents who might be of very strong religious convictions themselves, who are nonetheless happy and content to have their children brought up in a school where religion plays some part. But it's one of the next items on the agenda. It won't be easy to work through, but I think it'll be better worked through by negotiation and discussion rather than sort of strident demands.
Okay, I'd like very much to thank Dr. Manstra, Martin, and thank you for fielding the questions as they have come. To John, I think they've certainly raised a lot of questions, and I think a perspective that maybe hasn't generally been looked at. And Yvonne, I'd like to thank you very, very much for that contribution, and certainly the engagement with the audience. To the audience, I'd like to thank you as well. Jeepers, you've been very much engaged and awake with the discussions, and no more than I would expect. Huge engagement, and it's great to see the questions and the level of engagement here in Carsavine this morning. So have a good lunch. I think you're back at 3, and thank you very much.
I just want to add my thanks to Moira, because she wasn't here this morning, I think, when I suggested we have a great public servant in Moira Morell. I know she took unusual trouble to be here today, and I really want to acknowledge your presence and your support, as I said this morning. I also want to acknowledge Kate Kennelly. She wasn't here again this morning. She is our wonderful arts officer in Kerry. We're blessed to have her, and nobody else can have her. You know, she's been a great supporter of ours as well. And again, she and Moira make all of this happen, I think, for us by their presence here as much as by anything else. As I mentioned this morning, the library will close between 1 and 2:30, so please take all of your materials with you. The library will reopen at 2:30. First come, first serve for seating for Micheál Martin's interview. And as regards lunch, as I said, the town is full of restaurants. Enjoy your lunch. You won't be disappointed. Thank you.